There is something primal about the moment a hunter realizes that whatever has been watching him from the trees has been doing so for a very, very long time. Hey, welcome back. I'm glad you're here tonight. Go ahead and get comfortable, pull that blanket up, dim the lights a little, maybe close the blinds. What I have for you tonight is the kind of stuff that stays with you, the kind of stuff that changes how you feel about wide open spaces and dark tree lines and the silence that falls over a forest when it should be full of sound. Tonight, we have 5 stories. 5 times someone went out into the wilderness, armed and confident, and came home a different person, a quieter person, someone who stopped bragging about their time in the woods and started checking the locks twice before bed. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. Hit that subscribe button and tap the like, it truly helps. And honestly, you're going to want to be here for everything that's coming. Now, settle in. Let's begin. Now, our first story begins. The Ridge. I want to start by telling you that I am not a nervous person. I never have been. My dad raised me in the woods of western Pennsylvania, in a county where deer season is basically a religious holiday, and where almost every man you meet has a story about his first buck, his best shot, the one that got away. Hunting wasn't just a hobby for us, it was identity. It was the thing you did in the cold gray mornings of November, when the rest of the world was still asleep. And it was the thing that connected you to every generation of your family that came before you. I was 31 years old when this happened. I had been hunting since I was 9. I knew those woods the way you know your own house in the dark. Not just the layout, but the feeling of it, the personality of it. I knew which hollows held cold air, even in summer. I knew which creek crossings turned slippery after rain. I knew the deer trails that cut through the second-growth timber on the east side of the ridge. And I knew the open meadow, near the old fence line, where you could sit at dusk and almost always see something moving in the tall grass. That November, I was hunting with my Uncle Dale and a friend of his named Gary. Gary was from Ohio, a big, broad-shouldered guy who laughed loudly and told long stories and chewed tobacco, even when he was in a tree stand, which my uncle always gave him grief about. I liked Gary. He was the kind of person whose energy filled a room, or in this case, filled a camp. We were staying at my uncle's cabin, which was a generous word for what it actually was. A 2-room structure with a wood stove, a set of bunk beds, a propane lamp, and a folding card table where we ate our meals. It was perfect. We arrived on a Friday evening, the first weekend of rifle season. The drive up had been easy. The roads were dry. The sky was that deep steel blue you get in late autumn, and the woods on either side of the 2-lane highway were already stripped down to their bones, all bare branches and brown leaves, and the occasional smear of pine green where the hemlocks grew thick along the creek banks. Dale drove his old pickup, and Gary and I rode with him, the truck bed loaded with gear, rifles in the back seat in their cases. The whole situation smelling like gun oil and cold coffee from the thermos Dale had packed. We got the cabin open, got the wood stove going, and ate a meal of canned soup and bread that tasted unbelievably good after the drive. Dale spread out his topo map on the card table after dinner, and we talked through the plan for the next morning. He wanted me on the East Ridge, the high ground above the creek drainage, where the deer came through in the mornings heading up to bed, down for the day. Gary was going to work the meadow near the old fence line. Dale himself would post up in a stand he'd built years ago near the big white oak at the top of the hollow. The plan was simple, clean, familiar. We'd go out before light, get to our spots, sit until mid-morning, come back to the cabin for breakfast, and then decide whether to go back out for the afternoon sit. I had done versions of this exact hunt every November for over 20 years. There was nothing to suggest that this time would be any different. I went to sleep that night on the top bunk, listening to the wind move through the ridge above the cabin, listening to Dale snoring below me. And I felt that clean, tired feeling of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. I was happy. I was comfortable. I was not even slightly afraid. That was Friday night. By Saturday afternoon, everything I thought I knew about those woods had changed. I was on the East Ridge by 5:40 in the morning, well before first light. I had my rifle, a pack with water and snacks, and a small first aid kit, and I was dressed in layers wool base, fleece mid-layer, a quiet outer shell in blaze orange and camo. The temperature was in the low 20s, the kind of cold that puts a sharp edge on everything, that makes the leaves crunch like broken glass underfoot, and turns your breath into little clouds that float up and dissolve in the dark. I found my spot, a natural dip in the ridge, where a fallen oak had created a kind of blind, and where you could see maybe 60 or 70 yards down the slope toward the creek below. I settled in, got comfortable, controlled my breathing, and waited for the light to come. The first hour or so was perfect. The darkness softened into gray, and the gray became that thin, watery light you get on overcast November mornings. I could see the creek bottom below me. I could see the deer trail that cut across the slope about 40 yards out, and I could hear the usual sounds of the woods waking up a jay somewhere up the ridge, the distant drum of a woodpecker, the creak of trees settling in the wind. And then, at around 7 in the morning, I heard something that made me go still. It wasn't a loud sound. That's important. It wasn't a branch snapping or something thrashing through the brush. It was subtle, a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves somewhere downslope and to my left. The kind of sound that has rhythm to it. The kind of sound that has weight behind it. I shifted slowly, quietly, brought my rifle up and looked down the slope. Nothing. The leaves were still. The brush was still. The trail was empty. I told myself it was a squirrel. I told myself it was the wind. I settled back, controlled my breathing, and watched the trail. 10 minutes later, the sound came again. Same location, same slow, deliberate cadence. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause, crunch. This time I didn't move immediately. I just listened. And what made the hair on my arms go up even through 2 layers of clothing was the pause. The pauses were too long. Whatever was making that sound was moving with purpose, but it was also stopping, waiting. It wasn't a squirrel's scrabbling, random energy. It wasn't the irregular rhythm of a deer working through brush, stopping to browse. This was something that moved and then went deliberately still. I raised my rifle and looked through the scope, panning slowly along the base of the slope where the brush thickened before it gave way to the open timber along the creek. Brown, gray, tan, the usual palette of a November woodland. Nothing that didn't belong, nothing moving. I lowered the rifle and sat back, told myself, deer do this. They move and stop, move and stop. That's textbook deer behavior. That's what they do when they're working through cover, testing the wind, being cautious. Nothing unusual about that. But here's the thing that I kept coming back to. The thing I couldn't quite dismiss and couldn't quite explain. The sound had stopped the moment I moved. I hadn't moved loudly. I'd been slow, careful, deliberate the way you move in a tree stand or a ground blind. The controlled, minimal movement that you spend years practicing. I hadn't snapped a branch or shuffled my feet, but the sound, whatever was making it, had gone completely silent at the same moment I'd turned to look, like it knew I was looking. I sat with that thought for a while, poking at it, trying to find the rational explanation that would make it dissolve. The wind had shifted, and the sound had just stopped. I had imagined the timing. It was nothing. But then, maybe 15 minutes later, I heard it again. And this time, it was closer. Not by much. Maybe 10 feet, maybe 15. But it was closer, and the rhythm was the same, that slow, deliberate, crunch, pause pattern that had no business being as unsettling as it was. I am a man who has been in the woods his entire life. I know the sounds those woods make. I know the difference between a deer and a turkey and a bear and a person, not just by the sound, but by the feeling of the sound, the weight of it, the way it sits in the air. And I want to be honest with you right now, because this is the part that still bothers me. Years later, I could not identify what was making that sound. It didn't match anything in my catalog. It was too slow for most animals, too quiet for a person walking normally, too rhythmic to be random. It was exactly the kind of sound that made the ancient part of your brain, the part that's been around since before we had language, start sending up quiet little alarm signals. I stayed in position. I kept watching, and the sound kept moving. Closer. By 8 in the morning, I had been tracking that sound for nearly an hour, and my calm had been replaced by something else. I wouldn't call it fear yet. Not full fear. It was more like alertness raised to an uncomfortable pitch, that state where every sense is turned all the way up and your body is burning more energy than it should just sitting still. The sound was now somewhere directly below me on the slope, maybe 30 yards down. Still in the brush, still invisible. I tried everything I knew to get a visual on it. I swept the slope with my scope multiple times. I watched for movement, for the telltale twitch of a branch, the flash of color that didn't belong, the shift in shadow that meant something was there. Nothing. Whatever was down there in that brush was either very small or very, very still. That was the first escalation, the invisibility of it. Something that made that much sound should be visible to me at 30 yards in bare-limbed November timber with good light and a rifle scope. The fact that I could not see it was wrong. It was the first clean, wrong thing. The second wrong thing happened about 20 minutes later. I had started to talk myself back down, started working through the logical explanations again. I started convincing myself that I was spooking myself over a noise in the brush when I heard my Uncle Dale's voice from somewhere far up the ridge to my right. "Hey!" Just that. One sharp word, shouted once, and then nothing. I sat up straight and listened hard. Dale wasn't a shouter. In all the years I'd hunted with him, I had never heard him raise his voice in the woods, not unless something had gone wrong. We had an agreement. If you heard someone call out, you called back. It was just basic safety protocol, something my dad had drilled into me as a kid. I cupped my hands and called back, "Dale, you good?" Silence. Long silence. The wind moved through the bare branches above me. Somewhere down the slope, I realized I could no longer hear the sound that had been moving through the brush. Whatever had been down there had gone completely quiet when Dale shouted. I waited a full minute, then called again. "Dale!" "Yeah." His voice came back, and it sounded off, flat, like he was working to sound normal. "Yeah, I'm fine. Thought I saw something." "What'd you see?" Longer pause this time. "Nothing. Forget it." I sat with that for a moment. Thought I saw something. In 20 years of hunting with Dale, I had never heard him say anything like that, with that particular tone in his voice, the tone that meant he had seen something he didn't have a good name for. The third wrong thing happened just before 9 o'clock, and this one I can't explain away no matter how many times I've tried. I heard footsteps on the ridge above me, not in the brush, not on the slope, on the ridgeline itself, maybe 50 or 60 yards above my position, where the ground was more open, a rocky spine of high ground with sparse grass and exposed shale. Clear ground, ground where you could see a long way in every direction, where the sky was wide and gray above the bare trees, where there was nothing to hide behind except a few scattered rocks and the occasional scrubby wild cherry that grew at the edge of the limestone outcrops. Ground you could sweep with your eyes in seconds and be certain of what you were seeing. The footsteps were human. I am as certain of that as I am of anything in this story. Two-footed, upright, with the distinctive weight distribution of a bipedal stride heel, ball, toe, the way a person walks steady and unhurried, not running, not stumbling, Not the 4-beat irregular rhythm of a deer on rocky ground. 2 feet, evenly spaced, moving east along the ridge, which is the direction away from the cabin, away from everything, into the deeper and wilder section of the woods. I turned and looked up through the timber at the ridge above me. I raised my rifle scope and swept the ridgeline from west to east, slowly and carefully. And here is what I saw. Nothing. Not a person. Not a shape. Not a deer standing on its hind legs. I know how absurd that sounds, but your mind goes through possibilities fast when it needs to explain something. Not anything at all. The ridgeline was empty and clear against the gray sky. A clean line of rock and sparse grass and bare tree trunks. But I could still hear the footsteps, clear as anything. Still moving east, I lowered the rifle. My chest felt tight. The cold air that had felt normal and crisp an hour ago now felt different. Closer, denser, more present in my lungs. I stood up slowly, keeping behind the cover of the fallen oak. The footsteps continued steady, unhurried, completely indifferent to the fact that I was now standing in plain view, looking up at the ridge. There was no effort at concealment in those footsteps. They were just moving. Whatever was making that sound was either invisible or was somehow not registering against the terrain in a way that made any visual sense. But the sound itself was not distant. It was close. 50 yards, maybe 60. In open timber, with decent morning light, in the bare November landscape with every tree stripped down to its bones, I should have been able to see a standing person at 50 yards without any difficulty at all. I should have been able to see them clearly. There was nothing to see. My heart was going hard now. Not the excited, clean racing of a hunter who has spotted a deer and feels the shot coming. That feeling has its own particular texture, its own quality. This was different. This was the chest-tight, neck-prickling, adrenal acceleration of genuine alarm. The kind of physical response that doesn't ask your permission and doesn't care about your logic. I keyed my radio. We all carried small two-way radios for exactly this kind of situation. Basic safety practice that my dad had instilled in me before I was old enough to hunt alone, and said quietly, "Dale, Gary, I've got something weird going on up here. I'm hearing movement on the ridge directly above my position, and I cannot get a visual on whatever is making it. You guys see anything on your ends?" Gary came back first, his voice carrying that outdoor cheerfulness that didn't waver much. "Nothing down here at the meadow. Quiet as church. You okay?" A longer pause. Then Dale. His voice had that flat, careful quality I'd noticed when he'd shouted earlier. "Come down," he said. "Come down off the ridge and come back to the cabin." No explanation. No question about what I was hearing. Just come back. I have known Dale my entire life. He taught me to hunt when I was 9 years old. He is 71 years old and has spent 45 of those years in the woods of western Pennsylvania, in all seasons and all weathers, in conditions that would have turned most people around. He has seen black bears at close range and stood his ground. He has seen coyotes at night and watched them without flinching. He once saw what he believed was a mountain lion and reported it to the Game Commission and was politely disbelieved and has refused to argue about it since because he knows what he saw. He does not spook. He does not run from the woods. He has never, in 45 years, called off a hunt. "What's going on, Dale?" I said. "Talk to me." A pause that lasted too long. "Just come down," he said again. "We'll talk at the cabin." The footsteps on the ridge above me continued, eastbound, steady, patient, moving deeper into the wild section of the woods, now maybe 30 or 40 yards east of my position. I tracked the sound with my eyes, even though there was nothing to see. Just the ridge, just the sky, just the sound of something bipedal and unhurried, going wherever it was going. I did not run. I am proud of that in the way that a person is proud of small dignities under pressure. Running, in that moment, would have felt like an acknowledgement, a confirmation that whatever was happening was as bad as my body was telling me it was. and I was not quite ready to make that confirmation. So I moved fast. I moved down off that east ridge with my rifle up and my head on a swivel, and my heart hitting hard in my ears, watching both the slope below me and the ridgeline above me, and I did not look back, even though everything in me wanted to. The footsteps on the ridge followed me to the top of the descent. Then, they stopped. I heard them stop. Not fade, not grow distant, stop. One step, then silence, as though whatever was up there had come to the edge of the high ground and watched me go below the sight line and decided, that's far enough. We met at the cabin just after 9:30. Gary was already there, sitting on the tailgate of the truck, not saying much. Dale came out of the cabin when he heard me on the path, and he had a look on his face that I had never seen on him before and hoped to never see again. It was not quite fear. Dale was too old and too stubborn for full fear. It was more like a very careful, very controlled alertness. The look of a man who has recalculated something important. "Sit down," he said. I sat. "Tell me what you heard," I told him. The sound in the brush, the rhythm of it, the pauses that lined up with my movements, the footsteps on the ridge, the invisibility of all of it. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Dale, who normally had something to say about everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I saw tracks this morning, up near the white oak stand." "What kind of tracks?" He looked at me for a moment. "That's the thing," he said. "I don't know." Gary spit off the tailgate. "How do you not know? You know every track in these woods." "I know," Dale said. "That's the thing." He described them as best he could. Not quite human, not quite animal, something in between. Too large for a man, too narrow for a bear, with a spacing between the steps that suggested something moving very slowly and very deliberately. They went along the top of the ridge, and then he said this carefully, like he was still deciding whether to believe it himself. They went up into a tree, up the trunk of a big hemlock, up, and then gone. No tracks on the other side, no sign of a descent. None of us said anything for a while. Then Gary said, "We going back out this afternoon?" Dale looked up the ridge. Then he shook his head. "No," he said, "we're not." Dale has hunted those woods for 40 years. In all of that time, there are maybe a handful of things that have ever made him call off a hunt. We packed up and left before noon. Drove back down the mountain in silence. The three of us in the truck cab, the rifles in their cases in the back seat, the woods on either side of the road, dark and dense, and absolutely still. I watched the tree line the whole drive down. I don't know what was in those woods. I don't know what was moving in the brush below me with that patient, rhythmic, waiting sound. I don't know what made the footsteps on the ridgeline that left no print in the frost, no silhouette against the sky, no sign of itself at all except for sound. I have been asked if it was a person, some kind of stalker or trespasser, and I cannot rule that out. But I have also walked that ridge in the years since, and I have thought about the tracks Dale described, and I have thought about the way that sound stopped moving the instant I turned to look for it. And I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable truth. Whatever it was very good at not being seen. And it was watching us long before we knew it was there. That was 8 years ago. Dale passed away 2 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, the way a good man deserves to go. I didn't get a chance to ask him about that day one last time, and I think about that sometimes. I think about whether he had any theories he never shared, any other encounters in those woods over the subsequent years, anything that might have added one more piece to the puzzle. Gary never went back to Pennsylvania to hunt with us. He never said it was because of that day. He had other reasons, real reasons, distance and schedule and life getting complicated. But he also never talked about that day again, not in any of the times I saw him afterward. I brought it up once, at a cookout 2 summers later, and he gave me a look and said, "Man, let's not." And that was that. I have been back to those woods since. I go every season. I take my own son now, who is 12 years old and fearless in the way only 12-year-old boys can be. And I don't tell him the story of that November morning. I tell myself it's because kids don't need to carry that kind of thing. But if I'm honest, I think it's because I don't fully know the story myself. I don't have an ending for it. I don't have an explanation that holds up in the light. What I have is this: a morning on a ridge, sounds that moved with intelligence and went silent when observed, tracks that climbed a tree, and an old man who knew those woods better than anyone alive, saying 4 words I will never forget. I don't know. That's all. Just that. Dale, who had an answer for everything, looking up at the ridge with that careful expression and saying he didn't know. That's the part that stays with me. That's the part that wakes me up sometimes. On quiet November nights, when the wind is moving through the trees outside my window, and something in the sound of it doesn't quite belong. There is something about the forest at night that we have never fully made peace with. We carry fire, we carry guns, we carry maps and radios, and all the tools of a species that has long since declared itself the apex predator of this world. And still, in the quiet, something whispers that we are not alone, that whatever watches from the dark has been watching for longer than we've been able to ask why. Let that settle over you. Let the dark get comfortable, because the next story comes from further north, from a place where the winters are longer and the wilderness is deeper, and where a man with decades of experience learned in a single night that experience means very little to the thing that has decided it is interested in you. Let's move to the second story, The Blind. I have been a bow hunter for 18 years. If you're not familiar with the bow hunting world, let me just say that it is a particular kind of obsession, quieter than rifle hunting, more intimate, requiring you to get close, much closer. Rifle hunters can take a deer from 2, 3, sometimes 400 yards. When you're hunting with a compound bow, your ethical shot distance is maybe 30, 40 yards on a good day, in good conditions, with a calm animal. You have to be patient in a way that goes beyond ordinary patience. You have to become part of the landscape. My name is not important. What's important is that I live in northern Minnesota, about 40 minutes from the Canadian border, and that the country up here is not the genteel rolling farmland kind of deer hunting that you see on TV. This is boreal forest dense, dark, sprawling, the kind of country where cell service is a rumor, and trails are something you make yourself. Black bear country, wolf country, country that has a personality to it, a presence that you either learn to respect or that will eventually teach you to. I had been hunting a particular stretch of public land for 3 years before this happened. I'd scouted it thoroughly, found the travel corridors, set up a ground blind in a natural funnel between 2 patches of dense spruce, the kind of spot that deer used consistently in the early season, when they were still on a pattern before the pressure started to mess with them. I had a velvet antlered buck on camera, a wide 8-pointer I'd been watching all summer, and this particular October, I was determined to put that animal in front of me. My buddy Marcus came with me on this trip. Marcus is also a bow hunter, though less experienced than me. He'd been at it for maybe 5 years, and he was hunting a different spot, about 1.5 miles to my north, where he'd found a scrape line that he liked. We drove up together Friday after work, camped at a small site we'd used before, and planned to hunt Saturday morning, come back to camp for the afternoon, and then go back out for the evening sit. The campsite was at the end of a 2-track, in a small clearing ringed by birches that had gone gold in the October cold. We had a 2-man tent, a fire ring, a small propane stove for coffee in the mornings. It was the kind of setup that felt right, that fit the simplicity of what we were doing. We ate burgers we'd cooked on the camp stove, drank coffee, talked about the buck on camera, and went to sleep early. The morning was cold and dark and perfect. We were up at 4:30, dressed in silence, gathered our gear, and split off at the edge of the clearing, Marcus going north up the trail, me going east toward my blind. I remember watching his headlamp move away through the birches, getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared around a bend, and then I was alone. I have never had a problem with being alone in the dark. In 18 years of bow hunting, I have been alone in the dark more times than I can count, in more places than I can name. The dark is not something I fear. Or, it wasn't. Before this, my blind was a 15-minute walk from camp, and I reached it well before first light. I settled in, nocked an arrow, set up my rangefinder and my grunt call, and waited. The darkness around me was absolute. The spruce forest blocked all available sky, and on an overcast October morning in northern Minnesota at 5 in the morning, absolute dark really means absolute dark. I sat in it and let my eyes adjust, and I let the woods settle around me. By 6 o'clock, the light was coming up, and I was relaxed and focused and ready, which is the best state you can be in when you're hunting. Alert, but calm. Expectant, but patient. I was watching the funnel between the two spruce stands, the narrow corridor of open ground where I'd seen deer after deer on camera. I did not, at that point, feel anything wrong. The wrong feeling came 40 minutes later. It started with the deer. I saw them before I heard them, 2 does, coming through the timber to my left about 60 yards out, moving slowly and steadily in the direction of the funnel. Normal. Good. Does often came through first, ahead of a buck. I sat perfectly still and watched them. They came to maybe 45 yards. That's when they stopped. In 18 years, I have watched a lot of deer stop and test the wind, and it looks a certain way. Head up, nostrils working, ears swiveling. There's a direction to it. They're checking something specific, testing a cone of air, trying to locate a threat. What these does did was different. They didn't test the wind. They didn't swivel their ears. They simply stopped moving, both of them at exactly the same moment, and stood completely still, staring in the same direction. Not at me. To my left, north of me, behind me, and to the left, toward the thick spruce swamp that bordered that side of my hunting area. They stood there for what felt like 2 full minutes, completely motionless. Then the lead doe did something I had never seen a deer do in 18 years. Of watching them up close, she backed up, didn't turn, backed up slowly, step by step, keeping her body oriented toward the spruce swamp, until she had retreated, maybe 20 yards. Then she turned, and both deer walked away quickly, but quietly, with that careful, controlled pace. That means they have decided a place is wrong, and they are leaving it without triggering a pursuit response. They didn't run. That's important. Running means panic, means a loud crashing departure. These deer left quietly and deliberately, the way you leave a room when you've seen something you want to be far away from before whatever it is notices you're gone. I sat very still. I watched the spruce swamp. For a long time there was nothing. The light continued to improve. A chickadee landed on a branch 6 feet from my blind, regarded me without interest, and moved on. Normal forest stuff. Nothing unusual. I was starting to think the does had just caught my scent from an unfortunate wind shift. It happens, and deer can be dramatic about it when I heard something from inside the spruce swamp. It was a sound I want to be very precise about, because I've spent years thinking about it, and I want you to understand exactly what I heard. It was a low, long, resonant vocalization. Not a grunt, not a growl, not a howl. It was in between all of those things. It had the chest resonance of something large, not a small animal, not a bird. It had that particular quality of a sound that is being made with significant lung capacity, and it lasted for several seconds, fading at the end in a way that felt deliberate, like the end of a sentence. I sat with that sound in my chest for a full minute, not moving, not breathing more than I had to. I know what a wolf sounds like. I have heard wolves many times in that country, at many distances, in many contexts. A wolf howl at a quarter mile has a clean quality to it, a kind of austere beauty, and you know it immediately. This was not that. This was something that felt different, closer and lower, and with a character that I couldn't place in my catalog of northern Minnesota wildlife sounds. I told myself, bear, Black bears make vocalizations. They huff and blow and occasionally make sounds that don't fit neatly into what people expect. Maybe it was a bear, restless in its pre-den laziness, annoyed at something in the swamp. Maybe, but the does had left 5 minutes before the sound. And they had left in that particular way. Whatever was in that swamp, the deer had known it was there before it made a sound. I sat in that blind for another hour, watching the swamp. And in that hour, my situation changed 3 times in ways that, individually, I could have explained away. Collectively, they changed everything. The first thing, I heard movement in the spruce swamp. Not continuous movement, intermittent, with those long pauses I was starting to recognize as a signature. Something moving, stopping, moving, stopping. The movement had weight to it. The spruce in there was dense enough that you couldn't see more than a few yards in, but I could track the sound. And the sound was moving parallel to my position, not approaching, not retreating, but moving along the edge of the swamp to the north of me, at roughly a constant distance. Roughly. The second thing, I texted Marcus. My phone had 1 bar of signal, enough for texts sometimes, not always, and I sent, "You hear anything weird out there?" Big Vok from the swamp to my south. It took 20 minutes for his reply to come through, which was long enough that I had started to worry. When it did, it said, "Yeah. Something been circling my area for like an hour. Can't see it. What is that?" 2 of us, 1.5 miles apart. Both of us hearing something that moved in wide circles through the thick timber, making low vocalizations that neither of us could identify, refusing to be seen. The third thing happened at 9:30, and this is the one that made me get out of the blind. The sound stopped circling. For about an hour, I had been tracking it, that deliberate, patient, back and forth movement along the north edge of my hunting area. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Complete silence, where there had been intermittent movement. I waited. The silence continued. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5. I am not a man who spooks from silence. Silence is usually good in the woods. It means nothing has detected you. Nothing is alarmed. The natural order is proceeding. But this silence had a different quality. It was the silence after a sound stops. Not the silence of a morning that was quiet to begin with. It was loaded silence, waiting silence. And then I heard something directly behind my blind. My blind was a ground blind, a pop-up style, with fabric walls and a small mesh window I was shooting through. It was set against a large fallen birch for stability, which meant the back of the blind was up against solid wood, and there was maybe 3 feet of space between the back of the blind fabric and the birch trunk. That's where the sound came from. Right behind me, right on the other side of a single layer of fabric, a slow, deliberate breath. In, out, in, out. I turned around in the blind, as slowly as I have ever moved in my life. My bow was in my hand. My heart was hitting my ribs so hard, I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. I reached out and very, very carefully put 2 fingers against the back wall of the blind and pushed. Just slightly, just enough to put tension on the fabric and see if I could feel any resistance on the other side. I felt resistance. Something on the other side of that fabric pushed back. Not hard, not aggressively. A gentle, steady counter-pressure, like something pressing its weight against the outside of the blind wall to feel what was inside. The way you might press your hand flat against a wall to feel if there's heat on the other side. I yanked my hand back. I sat completely still. Outside, the breathing continued, slow and even and unhurried. The breathing of something that was not alarmed, something that had no reason to be alarmed, something that was simply curious and had all the time in the world. I called Marcus. No answer. I texted him. "Coming to you. Moving now." And then I unzipped the front of the blind slowly, trying to make no sound, though my hands were shaking, and I stepped out into the open. I did not look behind the blind. I walked north. I did not run, because something in me was absolutely certain that running would change the nature of the encounter in a way I did not want. I walked fast and deliberately, and I did not look back, and I did not stop until I reached Marcus, who was standing in the middle of the trail with his bow in his hand and the same expression on his face that I suspected was on mine. "You okay?" he said. "Yeah," I said. "Let's go to camp." He didn't argue. We walked back to camp together. We didn't talk much on the walk, maybe a few words here and there. Nothing that mattered. We were both in that post-adrenaline state where your body has burned through all its emergency fuel and everything feels slightly unreal. I was aware of every sound in the timber around us. I was aware of how narrow the trail was, how close the trees were on both sides, how easy it would be for something to simply step out. Nothing stepped out. We reached camp at around 10 in the morning. Marcus made coffee. I sat on the cooler lid and stared at the birches. After a while, Marcus said, "The breathing behind your blind. You sure it wasn't a deer?" "Deer don't put pressure back when you push on something," I said. He was quiet for a while. "No," he said. "They don't." We broke camp at noon, loaded everything into the truck, drove out the 2-track, hit the paved county road, and I didn't breathe right again until I could see the gas station on the edge of the nearest town, glowing against the gray October sky. Here is what I know. I had something pressed back against my hand through the wall of a ground blind in the middle of a spruce forest in northern Minnesota. I know the size and distribution of animals in that area. I know what each of them is capable of, and what each of them is likely to do. A bear can approach a ground blind, and a bear can lean against it, and a bear's weight against the outside fabric might feel like counterpressure against a hand. That is the best explanation I have. But bears breathe faster than that, and bears do not typically approach a ground blind occupied by a human-scented presence and then stand quietly against the outside wall for 5 minutes in calm, unhurried silence. The thing outside my blind was not alarmed by me. That is what I keep coming back to. It was not cautious. It was not spooked. It was simply interested, patient, in no hurry at all. I have replayed that moment 1,000 times. The feel of that counter-pressure through the fabric, the slow, even breathing on the other side of a wall I could have punched through with my fist. The certainty that whatever was there was completely aware of me and simply chose not to act on that awareness. The question that keeps me up is obvious, and I have no answer for it. What was it waiting for? I didn't go back to that spot that season. I hunted other country, closer to people, and I tagged out in mid-November on a small buck that I wouldn't have looked twice at in previous years. I was just glad to be done. Marcus and I talk about that morning sometimes. He's a rational guy, works as an engineer, thinks in systems and logic, doesn't have much patience for things he can't explain. His theory is that it was a large predator, probably a bear, possibly a cougar, which are increasingly being documented in northern Minnesota. Though the DNR doesn't love to talk about it, that was habituated to human presence enough to not be alarmed by it. His theory is that we spooked ourselves with a sequence of coincidences and let our imaginations fill in the spaces. I think he might be right. I think that's possible. I also know what I felt through that fabric. The evenness of the counterpressure, the patience of the breathing, the total absence of alarm. I went back to that spot the following year. I am aware that sounds like the decision of a person who didn't learn anything from his first experience, but I want to explain the logic. I am a bow hunter. That spot produced deer consistently for 3 years. The thing in the spruce swamp, whatever it was, had not harmed me. It had pressed back against my hand through a layer of fabric, and it had breathed, and it had stood outside my blind for 5 minutes in what felt like quiet curiosity, and then it had let me walk away without incident. That is not the behavior of a predator that wants to do damage. At least that's the argument I made to myself, sitting at home in November in the months between seasons, when the whole episode had taken on the softened quality of something that happened in another life. So I went back. Midday of the first week of season, when I knew I wouldn't be sitting in the blind, just to check things out, just to see the spot in daylight and maybe get some clarity. Marcus came with me. Same conditions as before. 2 of us, both with bows, which I acknowledged even as we were driving up was not exactly a comfort if things went wrong. I found the blind where I'd left it. I'd been too unsettled to break it down on the day, and when I'd gone back a week later to retrieve it, I'd taken Marcus with me, and we'd been in and out fast, barely pausing to look around. This time, I took my time. The blind was intact. Nothing had torn into it. Nothing had chewed at the fabric. Nothing had disturbed the ground stakes or the support poles. From the outside, it looked exactly as I'd left it 13 months earlier. I walked around to the back. The fallen birch was exactly as I'd left it, same angle, same position against the fabric wall. But on the birch trunk, at about shoulder height on a tall person, there were marks, long, parallel, 4 distinct lines in the bark, evenly spaced in the way 4 fingers are evenly spaced, each one cutting from the upper curve of the trunk down to where the birch rested on the ground. The marks were deep, not surface scratches, not the marks of a branch rubbing in wind, but deliberate depth incisions that had cut through the outer bark entirely and exposed the pale wood beneath. The kind of marks you'd make if you pressed 4 fingers against the surface of a tree and dragged them downward with significant, focused pressure. They had not been there before. I was certain of this. I had scouted that blind dozens of times over the 3 years I'd been hunting the spot. I knew every feature of that birch, its shape, its angle, the particular way the bark peeled along its upper curve. Those marks were new. Marcus stood next to me and looked at them without saying anything for a long time. "Bear," he said finally. "Maybe?" I said. We looked at the marks together, the spacing between the outermost lines, the depth, the fact that they were at shoulder height on a person of about 6 feet. "Maybe," Marcus said again, without much conviction. "I photographed them. I have those photos. I've shown them to people. A wildlife biologist friend, a few experienced hunters, some people on forums who have more knowledge of these things than I do. I've gotten a range of responses. Bear, mountain lion, a person deliberately making marks, an unknown species, nothing conclusive. The biologist said the spacing was slightly unusual for black bear. The others had theories. Nobody has given me an answer that sticks. What I think about when I think about those marks is the quality of the breath I heard through the blind fabric. Not labored, not excited, even and calm and patient. The breathing of something that had no anxiety about the situation, no urgency, something that was simply present and aware and taking its time. And at some point after I left that day, or days later, in the long stretch of time between my walking away and my coming back, it had stood at the back of that blind and pressed its hand against the birch trunk and drawn it slowly down. Why? I have no answer. Only the marks and the spacing and the memory of counter pressure through a single layer of fabric on a cold October morning in the spruce forest of northern Minnesota. Some encounters leave marks, not just on the wood, not just on the landscape, but on you. The way you stand, the way you listen, the way your eyes move to the edge of the tree line before they move anywhere else. The men and women in these stories didn't lose anything except a certain kind of innocence. The belief that when you go into the wild carrying something powerful, the power dynamic is clear. That you are the one who chooses. That you are the one who decides how the day goes. Some things in the dark have been deciding for a very long time. Rest easy. Breathe slow. This next story comes from the deep south, from cypress swamps and Spanish moss, and a duck hunting trip that 4 friends will spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. Now, the third story, the swamp, duck hunting in Louisiana, is its own world. If you've never been, let me try to describe it for you, because the landscape matters enormously to understanding what happened to us. Imagine standing in water, up to your knees, in absolute darkness, at 4 a.m, surrounded by cypress trees that rise out of the black water like pillars in some drowned cathedral. their knees jutting up from the waterline in irregular clusters that look, in a headlamp beam, like the exposed joints of something enormous just below the surface. Their canopy is hung with Spanish moss that drips and sways even when there's no wind you can feel, moving with a restless, patient life of its own. The air smells like mud and decay and something alive that you can never quite name. Not rotting, exactly, not unpleasant, exactly, but assertive, present, the smell of deep biology, of things living and dying in layers, of a landscape that is ancient and that has been conducting its business long before humans showed up to put a duck blind in the corner of it. The sounds are constant but wrong. Frogs that are loud enough to make you want earplugs. Insects in frequencies you don't normally encounter. The occasional splash of something in the water nearby, something that moves through the dark water without any apparent concern about what else might be sharing it. The distant call of birds you can identify if you've spent time there, and birds you cannot identify if you haven't. And below all of that, persistent and low, the kind of sound you feel more than hear, the pulse of a landscape that is alive in all its parts, that has no interest in the distinction between the living and the dead, that recycles everything immediately and completely. This is where we hunted. This is where we went by choice, willingly, and paid good money for the privilege. I'll call the four of us by first names only. Me, Richie, Devante, and a man named Tom, who was the one who organized the trip and had the connections with the landowner. Tom was from southern Louisiana, born and raised there, and had grown up hunting and fishing this particular stretch of swamp, and had been coming here since he was old enough to hold a shotgun. He knew the water levels and the bird patterns and the unwritten customs of the place. Richie and Devante were friends of mine from Dallas. Good men, both experienced hunters in their own right, but from the Texas hill country and the West Texas brush, neither of whom had ever been in a cypress swamp before. I'd warned them it was going to be different from anything they knew, that the landscape itself was different, that you had to make adjustments. I don't think either of them quite understood what I meant until we were standing in that water at 4 a.m, and the motor on our John boat went quiet, and there was nothing around us but cypress and darkness, and the first awareness, physical and immediate, of just how deep the water beneath your boots might go. The landowner, a man named Boudreaux, which is not his real name, but which suits him in a certain way, I can't entirely explain, had a small camp at the edge of the swamp. You reached it via a single dirt road that gradually narrowed road to lane to track to 2 muddy ruts, threading through marsh grass, and which required Tom's truck to ford 2 low spots that in a wet spring would have been impassable. The camp was a raised structure on pilings, with a screened porch on 3 sides and a wood stove and a generator that ran for a few hours in the evening and gave you enough power to charge phones and run the single overhead light in the main room. It smelled of decades of use, wood smoke and gun oil, and the particular mineral tang of the swamp that worked its way into everything. Boudreaux himself was there when we arrived, waiting on the porch with a coffee in his hand, and that particular stillness of people who have spent their lives in places where noise is not always a good idea. He was a short man in his late 60s, with the weathered, compacted look of someone who has worked outdoors since childhood. And he had a quality I have noticed in certain people who live close to wild places, a way of observing before speaking that goes beyond ordinary patience or politeness, a way of reading the space before committing to words. He was friendly, genuinely so, but the friendliness was not the first thing you noticed about him. The first thing you noticed was the watching. He showed us around, walked us through the access points and the best shooting spots and the morning routine. He'd set up decoys in the main pool the afternoon before our arrival and had a plan worked out for where each pair of hunters would position themselves. Tom knew the drill and translated for those of us who were new. We had dinner, a gumbo that Boudreaux's wife had sent in a cast iron pot, which was genuinely the best thing I've eaten in years. and then we went to bed early because the call was 4 o'clock and the swamp required you to be in position before first light, before the birds had committed to their morning patterns. I remember lying in my bunk that first night listening to the swamp sounds through the screen of the porch window, dense and layered and constant, not frightening in any specific way, but intense in the manner of complete unfamiliarity. Every sound required me to make a conscious decision not to assign it meaning, because my brain was eager to assign meaning to all of it, to map the sounds onto the catalog of things I knew, and many of them didn't map cleanly. The splashes could be nutria or gators or something else entirely, and I had no good way to sort them out from inside a bunk in the dark. I fell asleep eventually, which felt like a minor accomplishment. That was Thursday night. Friday morning, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. We limited out by 8, went back to camp feeling good, ate breakfast, and spent the afternoon resting. Everything normal. Everything right. Saturday morning was different. The first morning of hunting was perfect. We were in the water before first light, decoys set, boat hidden in a natural cove formed by the cypress roots. All 4 of us in position. The shooting was good. We limited out by 8 in the morning, which even Tom said was unusual and lucky. We motored back to camp in high spirits, cleaned the birds on the camp's cleaning table, ate breakfast cooked by Tom on the wood stove, and generally felt the good feeling of a hunt that had gone according to plan. Boudreaux came by the camp mid-morning to check in. He was a man of few words, and his check-ins were brief. He'd come, look at the birds, nod, make a comment about the weather or the water level, and leave. This time, though, he stood on the porch for a little longer than usual and asked Tom, in a quiet voice that he may not have realized I could hear, whether we'd seen anything unusual out there. Tom said no. Asked why. Boudreaux said he'd found something on one of his game cameras, a camera he kept on a dry levee at the edge of the property, facing a trail the deer used when the water was low enough. He'd checked it the afternoon before, and there was a stretch of footage, about 40 minutes of it, where the camera's motion-sensitive trigger had been activating repeatedly, but capturing nothing. Just empty trail, over and over, the motion trigger firing every few minutes for nearly an hour. Wind in the grass, Tom said. Maybe, Boudreaux said, but the wind wasn't blowing. He left shortly after. Tom shrugged it off. Richie and Devante, who hadn't heard the conversation, were already talking about the afternoon plan. I stood on the porch and looked out at the swamp. The swamp looked back. It was the first time I'd had that feeling, that specific, particular feeling of being watched by something that has more patience than you do. I told myself I was being melodramatic. I'd had a big morning. I'd been up since 4. The gumbo was sitting heavy. I went inside and had another cup of coffee and let it go. Saturday morning we were back in the water before first light. The morning started the same as Friday. 4 of us in position, decoys set, the cypress rising around us in the dark. But the shooting was different. Almost no ducks came through in the first hour, which Tom said was unusual for this spot. And the swamp around us was quieter than it had been the day before. Fewer frogs, fewer splashes, less of that dense, layered sound I'd fallen asleep to the night before. A particular quiet had settled over the area, and it was the kind of quiet that I've come to associate now, in hindsight, with a place that knows something I don't. The first sign was small. I almost missed it. We were about 90 minutes into the morning sit. It was getting on towards 6:30, and I was watching a gap in the decoys, waiting for movement on the horizon. Devante was about 20 yards to my right, partially hidden in the cypress roots. Tom and Richie were further out, positioned on the opposite side of the main pool. I heard Devante, very quietly, say, "Hey, hey," the way someone says it when they don't want to raise their voice but need to get your attention. I looked over. He was staring at the water to the north of our position, away from the decoy spread, away from the shooting lane. into the heavy timber where the cypress got thick and dark and the water was deep. He wasn't moving. His shotgun was at a low carry position, not raised, but his body language was wrong. Tense, alert in a way that had nothing to do with ducks. I followed his line of sight. The timber to the north was dark. The light was still coming up, and in that direction, the canopy was dense enough to block most of it. I couldn't see much. "What?" I said quietly. "Something in the water," he said, moving toward us. I watched the dark water between the cypress trunks, and after a moment, I saw it a slow, deliberate, V-shaped ripple on the surface, moving from north to south toward our position. Not fast, not the frantic movement of a duck landing or a nutria crossing. Slow and steady, the kind of movement that comes from something large, traveling just below the surface. "Gator?" I said. "Maybe," he said. "Too big." The ripple continued toward us. Steady, patient. I put my hand on the stock of my shotgun without thinking about it. The V-shaped ripple stopped about 30 yards out. Whatever was beneath the surface went still, and the water settled back to glass. And there was nothing visible, just the dark water between the cypress trunks and the gray morning light beginning to filter through the canopy, and the distant sound of Richie and Tom moving around on the far side of the pool. Devante and I watched that dark water for 5 minutes without speaking. Then the smell hit us. I've tried to describe this smell to people, and I always feel like I fall short, because the words that come to mind are imprecise. It was not the decay smell of the swamp, which I'd been smelling since we arrived, and which I'd made a kind of peace with. This was different, sharper, more immediate, with a quality that was almost metallic, almost like blood, but not quite like blood. It was a smell that communicated something directly to the oldest part of my nervous system, bypassing everything analytical, hitting the part of my brain that controls the fear response before I'd even had time to process what I was smelling. Devante turned to me. His face, in the growing light, was careful, controlled. "You smell that?" he said. "Yeah," I said. We both looked back at the water. I keyed my radio. Tom, you copy?" "Copy," Tom said. "Quiet on the radio, man. We got birds working." "Tom, you need to come to us. I need you to come to our position." Pause. "What's going on?" "Just come." They came, Tom and Richie, motoring around in the John boat, navigating through the decoys. By the time they reached us, the smell had intensified, and both of them reacted to it immediately. Richie made a face, and Tom stopped the motor and sat very still. "You smell that?" Devante said. Tom didn't answer right away. He was looking north, into the dark timber, the same direction Devante and I had been watching. His expression was something I'd never seen on him before, a focused, careful stillness that stripped away all the gregarious hunting trip energy and left something older and quieter underneath. "Get in the boat," he said. "What is it?" Richie said. "Get in the boat," Tom said again, very quiet. "Both of you, now." We got in the boat. I remember pulling Devante's arm, because he was still staring north, still watching the dark water, and he came reluctantly, keeping his eyes on that spot until the cypress trunks blocked his line of sight. Tom started the motor, and we moved south, toward the main channel, and he didn't look back, and he didn't slow down until we were out of the timber and into the open marsh, with sky above us and the camp visible in the distance. Nobody said anything for a long time. The smell faded as we put distance between us and the timber. By the time we reached the camp's dock, it was gone. We tied up and went inside. Tom stood at the window, looking out at the marsh. Richie made coffee without being asked. Devante sat at the table and looked at his hands. Finally, Tom said, "I've been hunting this swamp since I was 12 years old. I've been in here with my dad, with my grandfather, with every buddy I've got. I have seen every animal in this parish." He paused. "I have never smelled that." We told Boudreau when he came by that afternoon. He listened to the whole account without interrupting the ripple, the smell, Tom's reaction, and when we were done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The camera." He took us out to the levee on the east edge of his property. He showed us the game camera, a trail cam on a cypress post, facing a dry section of levee that the deer used. He pulled the SD card, and we looked at the footage on his laptop back at camp. The camera had activated 43 times during the previous night, between midnight and 2 in the morning. 43 triggers, 43 photos, and short video clips, 2 seconds each. Every single one of them showed the same thing: empty levee, dry dirt, dead grass, the dark tree line beyond. Nothing visible. Except, in one clip, the 31st activation, at approximately 1:17 in the morning, the clip was 2 seconds long, like the others. And for one frame, one single frame, there was something at the far edge of the camera's light range, not fully in the frame, not clearly visible. Something standing at the boundary of the illuminated area, where the camera's light faded into darkness. It was tall. Whatever it was tall, and it appeared to be looking directly at the camera. Boudreau closed the laptop. He sat back in his chair and looked at us with those careful, quiet eyes. "I'm going to ask y'all something," he said, "and I need you to be honest with me. When you were out there this morning, before Tom brought the boat around, were y'all waiting? Standing in the water?" "Yes," I said. "Devante and I were both on foot, waiting." He nodded, looked at the closed laptop. "Good thing Tom came when he did," he said. That was all he said. We asked him to explain, and he shook his head and said some things were better left where they were. He offered to refund part of our fee and suggested we leave in the morning rather than staying for the third day of the hunt. He said it in a way that made it clear it wasn't a suggestion. We left the next morning. I have thought about Boudreau's last words many times. Good thing Tom came when he did. The thing on the game camera, standing in the dark at the edge of the light, looking at the lens, the V-shaped ripple moving toward 2 men standing in chest-deep water in a dark cypress swamp. I have thought about what was beneath that surface. I have thought about what it was doing. I have thought about patience, and about the deep water, and about the difference between a hunter and whatever it is that waits. Richie has been back to Louisiana since. Not to hunt. He married a woman from New Orleans and visits regularly. And once, a couple of years after our trip, he drove out past Boudreau's road, just to see it. He said he sat in the car at the end of the 2-track for a while, looking at the marsh grass, and that he didn't get out. Devante quit hunting. Not directly because of this. He says it was a combination of things, that his life got busy, that he just didn't make the time. But he also gets a very particular expression when hunting comes up in conversation, a kind of inward looking, and after a moment, he changes the subject. Tom still hunts that swamp. He's been back every season. He told me once, maybe 2 years later, that Boudreau had the game camera footage professionally analyzed, sent to someone at a university, a wildlife biologist. He said the biologist looked at the frame with the shape at the edge of the light and said he couldn't make a determination about species from what was visible. Tom told me the biologist had asked Boudreau if he'd ever had unusual activity in that area before. Boudreau had told him about the camera triggers, about the smell, about the footprints on the levee, footprints that nobody had told me about until that moment, prints in the dried mud that were large and unusual and that nobody on the property had made. The biologist had asked for casts of the prints. Boudreau had already filled them in. I have never gone back, but I think about the water. The dark, still water between the cypress trunks and the slow, patient ripple moving toward 2 men, standing waist deep in the middle of a sound that was too quiet. And I think about Boudreau saying, "Good thing Tom came when he did." And I think about what he knew from 60-some years of living next to that swamp that he decided was better left where it was. The swamp keeps its secrets, water and darkness, forest and silence. The wilderness takes so many forms, and in each form it holds the same ancient truth, that there are things that were here before us, that will be here after us, and that in certain moments, in certain places, they become aware of us in ways we were never meant to know about. But not all of these stories happen deep in the wilderness. Sometimes the wrong kind of attention finds you closer to home. Sometimes the predator doesn't live in a swamp or on a ridge. Sometimes it lives in the places between the wild and the civilized, in the abandoned, the forgotten, the left behind. The next story comes from the American Southwest, from a man who hunted javelina alone in the desert hills of New Mexico, and who learned, over the course of a single long afternoon, that he had not been the only one watching. Here comes the fourth story. The Canyon, New Mexico, in February. You probably don't think of February in the desert as cold, but it is, especially in the high country, especially before dawn, when the temperature can drop into the teens and the wind comes off the Sangre de Cristo range and hits you in the face like something personal. But the days warm up fast, and by 10 or 11 in the morning, you're peeling off layers, and by mid-afternoon, the desert hills are wrapped in that clean, specific light that you only get in the Southwest. A light that makes the juniper and the ocotillo and the red rock look like they've been painted rather than grown. I had drawn a javelina tag after 2 years of applying. Javelina collared peccary, if you want to be technical, are small, bristly, pig-like animals that run in small herds through the desert brush. They're not the most challenging quarry in the world, but they're good fun to hunt, they're good eating, and the country you hunt them in is spectacular. My tag was for a specific unit in the south-central part of the state, a block of public land that included some canyon country I'd been wanting to explore for years. I went alone. That's relevant. My usual hunting partner, a man named Cole, who I've known since graduate school, had a conflict that week and couldn't come. I thought about waiting, rescheduling, but the tag had taken 2 years to draw, and the season was specific, and I decided I'd be fine on my own. I am a confident, experienced solo hunter. I had all the right gear, I'd filed a trip plan with Cole and with a family member, and I had a satellite communicator for emergencies. I was prepared, or I thought I was. The area I was hunting was accessed via a forest road that dead-ended at a trailhead. From there, it was a 2-mile walk into the canyon system, where I'd been told the javelina were most concentrated. I'd scouted it once before, the previous October, in preparation, and I knew the general lay of the land, a main canyon running roughly north-south, with several tributary side canyons branching off to the east and west, all of them choked with the scrubby brush that javelina love. I arrived at the trailhead Thursday afternoon, made camp at a pull-off a quarter-mile from the trail, ate a simple dinner of trail food, and was in my sleeping bag by 8 o'clock. Friday morning, I was on the trail, well before first light. The first day's hunt was textbook. I found fresh sign. Within an hour, rooted up, prickly pear, fresh tracks in the sandy wash bottom, the musk smell that javelina leave, and that is distinctive and odd and kind of wonderful once you know it. I worked the canyon quietly, glassing from the rim, and then dropping into the drainages, and by mid-morning, I'd spotted a small herd, 6 animals, moving through a brush-choked side canyon about 200 yards below me. I spent the rest of the morning trying to close the distance. Javelina have poor eyesight but excellent smell and hearing, and the wind in canyon country does whatever it wants, so the stalk required patience and repetition. Close, wait, close, wait, ease back when the wind shifted, circle and try a different approach. By noon I hadn't taken a shot, but I'd learned a lot about those animals and felt good about the afternoon. I ate lunch on a flat rock on the canyon rim and looked out over the landscape. Red rock, gray-green juniper, the pale sky of the high desert winter, silence with a quality that felt earned, the kind of silence you get when you're a long way from roads and people and all the noise of ordinary life. I saw the fire ring during that lunch break. It was below me, and to the south, on a small bench, about halfway down the canyon wall. A natural flat spot, maybe 30 feet across, sheltered by an overhang of red sandstone. From the rim, I could see it clearly, a circle of rocks, fire-blackened inside, with the remnants of what looked like a recent fire. Not ancient ash, recent ash, gray and uncompacted, the kind that hadn't been rained on. I noted it and moved on. People camp in canyon country. It wasn't my business, and it wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that I hadn't passed any vehicles at the trailhead or on the forest road coming in. I hadn't seen any sign of other people on the trail. For someone to have that camp, they would have had to come in from a different access point. There were others, I knew, rougher and less used, or they would have had to walk past my own campsite, which was at the only trailhead I knew of. I filed the thought and let it go. People knew these canyons better than I did. There were probably access points I didn't know about. I went back to hunting in the afternoon, found the javelina herd again, lost them when the wind shifted and blew my scent down into the canyon, relocated them further south near a large clump of prickly pear. I settled into a patient stalk, and by 3 in the afternoon, I was within 60 yards of the herd, downwind, with a good shooting lane. I took a clean shot, dropped a nice animal, and spent the next hour processing it in the field. By the time I had the meat bagged and the hide rolled, it was past 4 o'clock, and the shadows were coming on in the canyon. I had roughly an hour of good light left, and the trailhead was 2 miles away. I needed to move. I packed everything up, the meat in my pack, the rest of my gear, everything clean and organized, and started up the canyon toward the trail. I was maybe a half mile from the camp when I noticed the smell. Smoke. Fresh wood smoke carried on the evening wind. Somebody was burning. I stopped and looked around. Down the canyon and to the south, I could see a faint smear of smoke rising from the bench with the fire ring, thin and gray and unhurried. Someone was at the camp. Someone who had arrived at some point during the afternoon while I was in the canyon. Without passing me, without my seeing any sign of them, I stood and watched the smoke for a moment, thinking through the geometry of it. How had they gotten in? I had been in the canyon all day. I had not seen another person. I had not heard a vehicle on the forest road, which I would have heard in that country. In that silence, an engine carries for miles. I had not heard voices or seen any flash of color that would indicate another person's presence. The smoke continued rising, thin and steady. I started walking again. I was headed out. I wasn't going to worry about it, but the smoke bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate, and the bothersome feeling got louder as I walked. I was within a quarter mile of the trailhead when I heard footsteps behind me on the trail. I turned around. The trail was empty. The last light of day was painting the canyon rim orange, and the shadows in the canyon below were purple-gray. Empty trail, bare rock, a juniper to the left of the path, and the red sandstone face of the canyon wall to the right. I stood there for a moment, listening. Then I turned and kept walking. The footsteps resumed. Not immediately, maybe 30 seconds after I started walking again. A steady crunch of boot on rocky trail, maybe 50, 60 yards behind me. The pace was slightly faster than mine, as if whoever it was had fallen behind and was working to close the distance. I stopped again. The footsteps stopped. I turned around. Empty trail. I am not an irrational person. I was tired. I was carrying a heavy pack. I had been in the field for a long day, and my mind was in the particular strange state of late-day fatigue that sometimes makes you hear things that aren't there, or hear ordinary things and assign them wrong meanings. I told myself this. I told myself it was an echo sound, bouncing off the canyon walls in a way that made my own footsteps seem to come from behind me. I told myself I was hearing things. Then whoever was behind me spoke. It was not a shout. It was not a question or a greeting or any of the things a person normally says when they're approaching another person on a trail. It was a single word, said at a normal conversational volume, as if the speaker was standing right next to me, not behind me. And that word was my name, my first name, which I will not say here, but which is unusual enough that it could not have been a coincidence, could not have been random sound resolving itself into a familiar pattern. My name? I spun around with my hand on my rifle. The trail was empty. The canyon behind me was quiet and darkening, and absolutely devoid of human presence, as far as I could see, in both directions. My heart was going very hard. My mouth was dry. The pack on my back, heavy with meat, felt suddenly like a liability, something that slowed me down, that made me less mobile. I unslung my rifle. I did not chamber around. I was not going to shoot at a sound on an empty trail, but I held it in my hands, ready, and I walked, fast, behind me. After maybe 100 yards, the footsteps started again. This time they were faster, matching my pace. I did not stop again. I did not turn around. I walked as fast as I could, with a full pack on rough, rocky trail in fading light, and I focused on the trail ahead of me, and I did not speak, and I did not look back. The footsteps followed me for the entire remaining distance to the trailhead. They stopped at the edge of the trees, 30 yards from my truck. I reached my truck and got the key in the door and threw the pack in the bed and got behind the wheel and locked the doors. The heater was off and the cab was cold, and I sat there with my rifle across my lap and my hands still shaking slightly, and I looked out the windshield at the trailhead. The light was almost gone. The trail disappeared into the junipers 10 yards from the parking area, and beyond the junipers there was only shadow. Something was standing at the edge of the shadows. I couldn't see it clearly. That has to be said. The light was bad. I was rattled. My eyes were working overtime to see detail in low contrast shadow. But there was a shape there, a vertical shape, in the shadow, at the edge of the trail, that had not been there when I'd first looked. I sat and looked at it, and it stood there, not moving, not making any sound I could hear from inside the truck, just present. Present in the specific way that a person is present, standing with the stillness of someone who is watching and waiting and in no particular hurry. I started the truck. My name, said in that conversational voice on an empty trail with nobody there to say it. The footsteps that kept my pace. The shape in the shadows. I drove out. I drove fast, and I did not look in the rearview mirror until I was a mile down the forest road and the trailhead was out of sight behind a curve. When I did look back, the road was empty, dark and straight and empty. I drove out to the highway, and then I drove to the nearest town 30 miles, and I checked into a motel, and I called Cole from the room. It was late by then, past 10. He answered on the second ring, and I told him what had happened, and he listened. And when I was done, he said, "Are you okay?" "Yeah," I said. "I think so. Did you leave your camp gear out there?" I had. In the rush to leave, I'd left the tent and the sleeping bag and the camp supplies at the pull-off. I told Cole I'd go back in the morning. "Take someone with you," he said. I did. I went back the next morning with the motel owner's son, a high school kid named Armando, who I paid $20 to ride out to the trailhead with me. We drove out in daylight, retrieved the gear which was undisturbed, and were back at the highway in under an hour. Armando asked, on the drive out, whether I'd had a good hunt. I said yes. He asked if I'd seen anyone else out there. I said no. He nodded. Looked out the window at the desert rolling past. After a moment he said, "People go missing in those canyons sometimes. Not many, but some." "How do you mean?" I said. "Like, they go in and they don't come back out. My uncle found a truck at the trailhead once. Sat there 3 weeks. Keys on the seat. Guy was never found." We rode the rest of the way in silence. I've replayed that walk out of the canyon 1,000 times. I've looked for the rational explanation. Echo acoustics in canyon country, those exist. They're real. They can create convincing spatial illusions. Fatigue-induced auditory hallucination, also real, also documented. A fellow hunter who knew me from somewhere, who happened to be in that canyon, who was trying to get my attention on a trail, and who I missed in my paranoid hurry possible. Technically, but not one of those explanations accounts for my name being spoken. Not a shout from a distance, not a, "Hey," or an "excuse me," my actual name, a somewhat unusual name, said at the volume and register of someone standing immediately beside me. I don't know who was at the fire camp in the canyon. I don't know how they got in and out without passing me or leaving any sign I could find. I don't know how anyone would have known my name or why they would have said it on a dark trail instead of just walking up to me like a person. I know what I heard. I know what I saw at the edge of the shadows by the trailhead. I know how it felt to drive away from that place with my hands on the wheel and something standing in my headlight's edge. I know that something in that canyon knew my name, and I know that whatever it was, it let me leave. That's the part that still doesn't sit right. Not the fear of what it was, though. That's real, and I won't pretend otherwise. The part that stays with me, that lives in the back of my mind on quiet nights, is that it let me leave, as though it had decided that I was not what it wanted, as though it had looked at me, out there on that dark trail with my pack full of someone else's meat, and made a calculation, and found me wanting. Something let him leave. Something decided. That thought is a cold one, isn't it? The idea that the thing you're afraid of has a decision-making process, has criteria, has a reason for what it does or does not do. We're almost at the end of tonight. One more story. I want to thank you for staying, for being here in the dark with me, for trusting me with this quiet hour. The last story is different from the others. It happens closer to civilization, in a place you might think would be safer. A man hunting turkey in the Ozarks on a spring morning, alone in the woods in the early hours, when the air smells like wet earth and new growth, and everything should feel like renewal. It does not feel like renewal. Let me tell you about the morning that changed everything for him. And now, the final story. The hollow, spring turkey season in the Ozarks is the most optimistic kind of hunting I know. You're done with winter. The world is greening up. The birds are loud and brash and full of themselves, and getting a gobbler to commit to your calls is one of the most satisfying things I've found in 30 years of chasing them. There is nothing subtle about a tom turkey on a spring morning. He is all noise and color and arrogant display, strutting and gobbling, absolutely certain that he is the most important creature in the woods. I love it. I have hunted turkey since my 20s, and at 53, I am still as eager on the first morning of season as I was the first time I ever pulled on camo in the dark. There's something about it that never goes stale. This particular April morning, I was hunting a piece of private land in northern Arkansas, about 800 acres of mixed hardwood and pasture owned by my friend's family for generations. My friend, I'll call him Holt, grew up on this land and knew every inch of it. He had let me hunt it for years, and I knew it nearly as well as he did. I knew the roost trees where the birds slept, the strutting zones where they came after fly down, the creek bottoms and the old log roads in the hollows where the timber was old and dark, and the morning mist sat low until the sun got high enough to burn it off. Holt was not with me on this particular morning. His mother had passed away 2 months prior, and he was still in the thick of settling the estate, managing the farm, dealing with the 100 practical tasks that follow a death and that nobody warns you about. He had offered the property to me as he always did, but he wasn't up for hunting himself. He said to go, enjoy it, bring him some pictures. I arrived the evening before, parked at the edge of the main pasture, and walked in to have a look. I found birds roosted in the big white oaks along the creek bottom, heard them clucking and settling as the light died, heard a gobble as the sun went down. Perfect. I went back to my truck, ate a sandwich, slept in the cab with a sleeping bag pulled over me, and was up at 4:30. The morning felt right. Everything about it felt right. The temperature, the light coming up, the smell of the woods, the distant gobble from the creek bottom as soon as the first gray showed in the east. I set up on the edge of a small field about 300 yards from the roost, where a logging road came out of the timber and offered a nice open area for a tom to strut. I had my turkey vest, my shotgun, a slate call, and a box call, and the particular focused calm that early turkey mornings produce. The birds flew down at 5:40. I heard them, the heavy wing beats, the crash of landing and then silence, and then a gobble from the field edge that told me everything I needed to know. He was working. I gave him a couple of soft yelps. He answered immediately, aggressive and loud. He was coming. By 6:15, I had a mature gobbler on the ground, my tag filled, my morning complete. I sat in the field for a while, just enjoying the sunrise, the way you do when you've done the work and the pressure is off and the world is just the world again. A red-tailed hawk crossed the field. Crows fussed somewhere in the timber to the west. A light breeze came through and moved the last of the morning mist. I should have gone back to the truck. I should have been satisfied. Instead, I decided to take a walk through the hollow on the north end of the property, an area I'd been meaning to scout for years. Old timber in a deep hollow that Holt had always said held birds, but that I'd never taken the time to really explore. I had time. The morning was beautiful. I tagged my bird, hoisted my pack, and headed north toward the hollow. That decision is the one I replay. The hollow was everything Holt had described. Old timber, white oaks and hickories that had to be 200 years old, the canopy so dense that even in spring, the light on the hollow floor was dim and green and cathedral-like. A small creek ran through the bottom, clear and cold over gray limestone. Ferns along the banks, just coming up. Morels. I'd bet, if I came back in 2 weeks. Everything exactly right. I was maybe a quarter mile into the hollow when I noticed the quiet. Not a dramatic silence, not the sudden, bird-stopping silence that every hunter knows means something has alarmed the birds. This was more gradual, more subtle, the kind of quiet that accumulates. I'd been walking through an active spring morning cardinals, towhees, woodpeckers, the occasional turkey hen clucking somewhere distant, and at some point all of it had stopped, so gradually that I hadn't noticed the subtraction until it was complete. I stopped walking, stood still, listened. The hollow was silent. Not just quiet silent in a full closed-down way, the way it gets in the depths of August heat, when everything retreats from the midday, except this was April at 7 in the morning when the woods should have been at full voice. I looked around. Timber, creek, ferns, my own breath rising in the cold air. Nothing unusual. I started walking again. Slowly. 2 minutes later, I found the blind. It was in the base of a large hollow oak, on a slight rise above the creek. A rough, improvised structure. Branches and leaves and old dried grass woven into a kind of nest that fit neatly into the cavity at the tree's base. It was not a hunting blind in any conventional sense. No shooting lane, no clear purpose that aligned with any hunting strategy I knew. It looked, honestly, less like a blind and more like a den. Something lived in it, or had lived in it recently. I crouched down and looked at it closely, without touching it. The materials were dry, but not ancient. This had been built within the last season or two, maybe more recently. The grass was brown, but undecomposed. I could see where something had compressed the interior, created a hollowed-out pocket that fit roughly the shape of a large body, larger than a deer, shaped differently. The kind of impression left by something that used the space regularly, that returned to it. My eyes went to the ground around the base of the tree. Tracks. Not clean, well-defined tracks. The leaf litter was too thick for that, but impressions. Disturbances in the leaves around the tree base that radiated outward in several directions, like the roots to and from a place that was returned to often. I followed one of those trails with my eyes to where it disappeared into the ferns along the creek. At the edge of the ferns, where the leaves gave way to the moist soil along the bank, there was a partial track, just the front half of it, just the ball and toes, but visible and clear in the dark creek bank mud. I've seen bear tracks. I've seen human tracks. I've seen both in situations where they were ambiguous, where a bear's track, particularly the front half of it without the heel, can look surprisingly human. I am aware of this phenomenon, and I was aware of it as I crouched there looking at that partial print. It was large. It was very large. I stood up slowly and looked around the hollow. The silence was still total. No birds. No creek noise, which was strange, because the creek had been audible since I entered the hollow, and now I couldn't hear it, even though I was standing 20 feet from its bank. I looked at the water, and it was moving. I could see the current, but I couldn't hear it, as though something had been turned down. I started back the way I came, not running. I want to be clear about that. I was not running, but moving with intention, at a pace that covered ground quickly without triggering the run response in whatever part of me was sending up signals. I kept my shotgun low ready in my hands, though I was honest enough with myself to know that it made me feel safer rather than actually making me safer. The trail back through the hollow was the same route I'd come in on a deer trail along the west slope above the creek, winding through the old timber. I had walked it 20 minutes earlier in perfect morning quiet, watching for turkey sign, relaxed and happy. Walking it now was different. The difference was in my peripheral vision. That's the most accurate way I can describe it. There was something happening at the edge of what I could see, movement in the timber, that was always just beyond my ability to directly observe. When I looked left, there was nothing. When I looked right, there was nothing. But in the space between looking, in the space my eyes moved through in the transition, something was there. Movement that went still when I turned, shape that resolved into shadow and branch when I focused on it. 3 times in the walk back through the hollow, I stopped and turned quickly, trying to catch it. 3 times, nothing. Just the timber, the mist, the dark hollow floor. But the feeling of being flanked, of something moving parallel to me through the trees, just beyond the range of direct observation, was constant. And it was one of the most specific and detailed feelings I have ever had in the woods. It was not vague anxiety. It was not atmospheric dread. It was the very precise, physical sensation of being tracked. I reached my friend Holt on the phone as soon as I cleared the hollow and got signal. "I found something in the North Hollow," I said. "A den or a bed, built into the base of a big oak, and tracks I can't identify. Anything you want to tell me about that area?" Silence on the line. Then, "What kind of tracks?" "Partial front print. In the creek bank. Large. Oddly shaped." Another silence. "I was going to tell you about the hollow," he said finally. "I just didn't want to sound." He stopped. "Sound like what?" "Like I was making things up." "Holt." "There's been something in there for a few years. My mom knew about it. She wouldn't let us go in there when we were kids. Wouldn't explain why." He stopped. "After she passed, I went in there to see what she'd been keeping us out of. Found the oak you're talking about. Found the same kind of tracks you're describing." He paused. "Then I heard something. In the timber. Close. And I left." "What did you hear?" "It vocalized," he said. "I don't know what else to call it. It made a sound that wasn't a bird or a coyote or anything I know. And then everything went quiet, just like you said." "Have you been back?" "No," he said. "Have you gotten out of the hollow?" "Yes, I'm in the pasture." "Then stay there," he said. "Don't go back in." I stayed in the pasture. I stood in the sunlight in the open field, with my back to the tree line and my face to the hollow's entrance, and I waited. I'm not sure what I was waiting for. I wasn't going to go back in, but I was not willing to just leave. Something in me needed to see it. Not see inside the hollow. I was done with the hollow, but see the edge of it, from the safety of the open ground, and wait to see if anything would come to the edge. For 40 minutes I stood there, and nothing happened. The morning was warming up, the mist was burning off, and the hollow entrance, a gap in the timber where the deer trail came out of the trees, sat 20 yards away and was quiet and dim and entirely ordinary looking. Then at the edge of the gap in the timber, something moved. I raised my shotgun. It was not an animal. not in any configuration of animal that I could resolve into a known species. It was too large, too upright, too deliberate in the way it moved to the edge of the timber and stopped. In the shadowed timber at the tree line, with the morning light throwing everything into contrasts, I could not see it clearly, but I could see enough. Tall, dark, still, once it reached the edge of the trees, with the absolute stillness of something that has decided to observe without being observed, and which was failing in that second goal. It stood there for what I can only estimate as 10 seconds. 10 seconds is not very long, except when you are standing in a field with a shotgun pointed at a shape at the edge of a dark tree line, in which case 10 seconds is an extremely long time. Then it stepped back into the timber and was gone. No sound, no crashing brush, no retreating footsteps. Just gone. I lowered my shotgun. My arms were shaking. Not badly, not so badly. I couldn't have shot if I'd needed to, which is a thought that I am grateful for, even though it does nothing to explain what I was looking at. I stood there in the morning light in the open field, and I breathed. And after a while, the shaking stopped, and the birds came back. Cardinals first, then the woodpeckers, and the hollow behind the tree line was just a hollow again, shadowed and quiet, holding its history the way old places do. I picked up my bird, shouldered my pack, and walked back to the truck. I did not look behind me. I didn't need to. I knew it wasn't following me. I knew the same way I knew it when I felt it being tracked through the timber, with the same specific, physical certainty that it had come to the edge of the trees to watch me leave, to stand in the shadow and watch me walk away across the open ground, getting smaller, and then turn and walk back into its hollow. I was the visitor. I was the one passing through. Whatever lives in that hollow, it lives there. It has lived there long enough that Holt's mother was keeping her children out of those woods when Holt was small. Long enough that the signs of habitation in that oak den were layered and established and worn. Long enough that the wildlife in the hollow had made a kind of peace with it, or at least a kind of arrangement, the birds going quiet when it moved, the deer making their paths wide around it. The whole ecosystem organized, in small and careful ways, around its presence. I have been hunting for 30 years. I have never shot at anything I couldn't identify. I did not shoot at the shape at the edge of the timber that morning. I do not regret that decision. Holt sold the property the following year. The market was right. He didn't want the responsibilities of it without his mother, and it was the practical decision. He told me, when he signed the papers, that he hadn't been back to the North Hollow. I asked if he'd told the buyers anything about what was in there. He looked at me for a moment. What would I tell them? He said, that there's something in the hollow that my mom knew about for 30 years and that we can't identify and that won't leave? That's not exactly a selling point. Did you go back in before you sold? No, he said. I left it where it was. We were quiet for a moment. Then he said, my mom grew up on that land. She knew every inch of it. She was not a woman who scared easily. He paused. She kept us out of that hollow our whole childhood. Never explained why. And you know what? I think she had an understanding with whatever was in there. I think she knew it was there, and it knew she was there, and they stayed out of each other's way for 30 years. And now? I said. He shrugged. Now new people own the land, and they don't know. I have thought about that a lot. The new owners, whoever they are, walking their property in the first weeks of ownership with that fresh land energy that new landowners have, the eagerness to explore every corner, walking down into the North Hollow, seeing the hollow oak, the worn den at its base, the trails radiating out in the leaf litter, following one of those trails to the creek bank, crouching down, seeing the partial track in the dark mud, and not knowing what they're looking at, not knowing that whatever made it has been there far longer than they have. Not knowing that this particular piece of land, this beautiful old hardwood hollow in the Ozarks, has already been claimed. I hope they figure it out before the hollow teaches them. And there it is. 5 nights in the wilderness. 5 moments when the confidence of someone who knew the woods, who had spent years in the woods, who had every reason to feel safe in the woods, was quietly, completely, and permanently revised. I want to take a moment to acknowledge you, the one who stayed all the way to the end. You didn't click away during the swamp. You didn't leave when the shape appeared at the edge of the Ozark Hollow. You sat here in the dark and you listened, and that means something. That kind of patience is rarer than you'd think. So here's what I want to ask you, in the spirit of everything we've just been through together. If you've spent time in the wild, if you've hunted or hiked or camped or just passed an afternoon in the woods, have you ever had a moment where the feeling changed, where the landscape went quiet in a particular way, where something at the edge of your vision moved just out of focus, where the space around you felt suddenly like it was occupied by something that wasn't there a moment ago? Have you ever felt, truly felt, in the physical, wordless way, that these men and women felt it? That you were being watched? I want to know. Tell me in the comments. Not because I'm collecting stories, though I am, but because these experiences deserve witnesses. Because the people who have them often don't talk about them. For exactly the reasons the people in tonight's stories don't fully talk about them. Because the words are inadequate. Because the explanations don't hold. Because saying it out loud makes you sound like a person who has lost their grip on the rational world. You haven't lost your grip. You're paying attention. If tonight gave you something, a chill, a feeling, the urge to check your locks or look out your window at the dark yard, then please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to keeping these stories coming. I have more. I have so many more. Stories from the mountains and the plains and the places between that don't have good names. Places where the ordinary rules seem to apply right up until the moment they don't. I'll be here. I'll keep the light on. And to whatever might be listening in the dark, at the edge of this hollow, at the rim of this canyon, in the spruce swamp, and on the cold ridge, and in the deep cypress cathedral of a Louisiana night, we see you. We've always seen you. We just didn't always know what to do about it. Sleep well, if you can. I'll be here next time with more.